So I think the Jezebel spirit is a Nephilim spirit. There's nothing about her. It's not like she's possessing people. It's the spirit that was on her is still alive and active today. And I think that's what we have to understand. That the Jezebel spirit isn't just about one ancient woman who was queen, who is an evil queen, and is still affecting people today. It's the spirit that was on her, running her, causing her to do everything that she did, is still active today in the church. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tat2d Preacher Podcast. This is episode 36. Hope you're all doing awesome today. This is the podcast that takes a look at subjects and topics relating to Christ, culture, and Christianity from a biblical perspective. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the subject or the topic of the spirit of Jezebel. Now, if you've been paying attention to what's been making its rounds in Christian social media viral land, you would have heard the latest incident involving Mark Driscoll and the Stronger Men's Conference that happened just a few weeks ago, where to kick off the conference, they had a male or a former male stripper perform, do this whole routine involving a pole and sword swallowing, and to which Mark Driscoll, when he went up to speak, when it was his time to speak the next day, his topic of his message was supposed to be on Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel. And so he prefaces his message by getting on his knees and saying, "Gentlemen, the spirit of Jezebel has already been here. The Jezebel spirit has already been here. She kicked off the conference," basically calling out the leadership of the conference for having this former male stripper do his routine. And he equated that with the influence and the inspiration of the spirit of Jezebel, to then which has lent to a whole bunch of other people making videos on the Jezebel spirit. And so in this episode, I want to do a bit of a deep dive into the Jezebel spirit. What is it? Who is it? What's the origin of the Jezebel spirit? I mean, I grew up in church, and so it's a common thing that I heard growing up, and you will hear it all the time in church. They have the spirit of Jezebel. This church is operating with the spirit of Jezebel, or someone's possessed with the spirit of Jezebel. But what exactly does that mean? And so that's what we're going to get into in this episode. So if that interests you, you're going to want to stick around. But before we get there, quickly, just want to let everyone know, if you haven't yet followed me, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, my handle is the Tat2d Preacher. Go follow me, go subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcast, give it a review, leave a comment. It just helps me get this podcast into the stream of podcasts that are out there. So that's it. Spirit of Jezebel. Let's dive in. Hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, so the Jezebel spirit. Now, there's a few different layers to this topic and to who she is and to what has led to this phrase, the Jezebel spirit. And so the first layer I want to look at is just to look at who's Jezebel. If there is a Jezebel spirit, well, who's the Jezebel figure that the phrase is coined after? So I want to look at what the biblical narrative has to say on who Jezebel is. And then the second layer is Jezebel's past. What led her to be who she is? Because there's a lot of stuff in there that's very interesting, which then leads to the third layer, and that's the supernatural element behind it. And this is where we'll get into the spirit part of the Jezebel spirit. So that's That's how I'm going to break this down here. So the first layer is who's Jezebel? And so we are introduced to Jezebel in the book of 1 Kings, and we see that she's the wife of King Ahab, who was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And what we discover about who this Jezebel figure, this Jezebel woman is the narratives of 1st and 2nd Kings portray her as a woman of great wickedness who persuades her husband and others to oppose Yahweh by committing evil deeds. In fact, in 1 Kings 21:25, it says this. It says, "Truly there was no one like Ahab, who had sold himself by doing evil in the eyes of Yahweh, whose wife Jezebel urged him on." So she becomes the queen of the northern kingdom of Israel, and she's known as urging, pushing her husband, as well as others, to oppose Yahweh by committing evil deeds. And so what are some of these evil deeds that Jezebel does that we see in the text? Well, the first is she is a Baal worshiper. And she is a worshiper of the false god Astarte or Asherah as well. So she promotes idolatry in Israel, the worship of false demonic deities. She also threatens the prophets of Yahweh, prophets of the Lord, has them killed. In fact, the most famous prophet of the Old Testament, Elijah, she threatens him so much so that he goes into hiding. I mean, this is Elijah. And the most famous story that we see of Elijah and Jezebel is this massive confrontation where there were the 450 prophets of Baal put together by Jezebel against Elijah and Yahweh. And the goal was to see which god would send down fire from heaven and consume the sacrifice. And so the prophets of Baal went first, did their whole evil, demonic routine. They're cutting themselves, spilling blood, doing their chants and their prayers and all that stuff. Doesn't work. Elijah prays to Yahweh. Fire falls from heaven, consumes it, wins this showdown. Yahweh wins. Elijah is probably feeling on top of the world. Yet the very next scene, Jezebel threatens the life of Elijah, and he goes into hiding, like just riddled by fear. And so she was someone that, again, threatened the lives of the prophets of God. We see her ordering the murder of people. And the famous example is she organizes this plot to kill a dude named Naboth because she wanted his land. So has this guy killed. And scholars go on to say that this text isn't exhaustive about the things that Jezebel did, but this is just some of the stuff that through her using King Ahab as a puppet, using that power, basically had him give the authority to all the evil deeds that Jezebel wanted to do and to unleash on God's people. So she was a murderer. She led them into false worship and idolatry. And she's also, according to 2 Kings 9, verse 22, it says that she was involved in acts of prostitution and witchcraft. And so this woman, this queen, is bad news from the get-go. She marries King Ahab. He then gives her free rein to unleash havoc on God's people, gives her power and authority to literally raise up 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets to the goddess Astarte or Ashereth, finances them, gives them resources, has them eat at her table. We see Ahab giving her authority to kill the prophets of God. namely Elijah, ordering the murder of random people because she may want something from them. And so this is the picture that we see in the text. This is not a nice woman. She was evil. She was wicked. She was manipulative. She was operating with witchcraft and the occult, organized prostitution and seduction and sexual perverseness. I mean, not a good woman. And so this is Jezebel. This is who she is. This was her reputation. So this is what we see here in the biblical narrative of this woman. Now, we have to ask the question, how did she get to being that way? Did she wake up one morning and decide to be an evil woman? Like, how did she even get to, be the queen of the kingdom of Israel? Like, how did that happen? Well, second layer now is I want to go back and I want to look at her upbringing, because there's a lot of stuff here from the little that we can glean from what the Bible says about her upbringing that I would suggest seems to indicate some solid reasons of how she ended up so wicked, so evil, so demonic, and to do all the things that she did. So who was Jezebel? Where did she come from? Well, we see that she is the daughter of King Ethbaal. I think I'm pronouncing that right. King Ethbaal, who was the king of Sidon. And Sidon was a surrounding nation to Israel, pagan nation. And we learn that he was the high priest in the Phoenician cult to the goddess Astarte. He was also the high priest to the local chief god of Sidon, which was Baal Melkart. So 2 demonic deities. He was king of Sidon, but also he was the high priest. And so he pushed the worship of these 2 demonic deities on his people. This was a part of their culture. This was a part of their society. And so Jezebel was his daughter. And so she grew up as the high priestess to both the goddess Astarte, or Ashereth, and Baal Melkart. So she was born to a royal family that was immersed in idolatry for who knows how many generations leading up. But she's born to this royal family, has a dad that was a king but was a high priest to 2 demonic deities. Now, when we think about idolatry, the Bible is riddled, especially in the prophets and then the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, with stories of ritual and ceremony and practice that the nations did in worship to their gods. I mean, we see child sacrifice, the offering of your firstborn children, the cutting of your flesh, blood covenants, then there's, of course, the offering of animals. And so a lot of these ceremonies and these rituals and these practices were done on a regular basis. And you have Jezebel growing up in a household where she's actively a part of these ceremonies and practices and rituals, so much so then she becomes the priestess, the high priestess to these demonic deities. And so you think about what that would do to a little girl. I mean, we see stories right now in our modern day of satanic ritual abuse survivors who are born into these satanic covens and who go through the most horrific, demonic rituals and ceremonial experiences imaginable. And we see the devastation and the trauma that has on little kids and on people as they get older. And we see the demonic oppression that can take place as a result. And so you have this little girl, Jezebel, growing up in a household where this kind of stuff was happening. And it wasn't just things she just experienced, but then she was elevated, promoted, because being the daughter to the king, being a daughter to the high priest, she becomes the high priestess of these orders. And the kind of demonic and ceremonial, ritualistic stuff that she would have had to do. And it's like we see the result of it happening in our world today. And so it makes complete sense that back then it would have completely altered who she is. I mean, how can you grow up in that environment and not be affected in a demonic, in a negative fashion? And so seeing that was her upbringing, to me, it makes perfect sense to then take the next logical step. And as this little girl grew up in that environment for all those years, when she reaches adulthood, she's gone, man. Like, it makes perfect sense. She becomes this evil ruler as we see. But then as she gets older, she's high priestess to these demonic deities. She's the princess in Sidon, being the king's daughter as well. And then you have King Ethbaal and King Ahab. They make this political alliance. And part of that alliance was the exchange of, or Jezebel would then become Ahab's wife to kind of solidify this political alliance. So this is how she gets to becoming the queen of the northern kingdom of Israel. But we have to remember what God said to the people of Israel before they went into the promised land through Moses. He warned them over and over again, do not intermarry with the pagan nations around you. It wasn't a race thing, wasn't an ethnicity thing, wasn't a prejudice thing. He said don't do it because in the culture of that day, every nation had their own list of gods or demonic deities that they worshipped. And so when a man and a woman entered into marriage, both sides, both parties would bring in the gods that they worshipped, and then each one would adopt the other. Each one would adopt the other's gods, and then they would worship all of them. So this is why God said, marry within your own people, because you had a man who worshipped Yahweh, a woman who worshipped Yahweh. They come together, they both worship Yahweh. But if you have a man who worships Yahweh and then a woman who worships 16 other gods, and they come together, then all of a sudden you have this man who's supposed to only worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone, adopting 16 other gods that he will then worship. That's why God says, if you do this, that's going to be a snare to you. They're going to lead you into idolatry, which is what happened over and over again. And here you have King Ahab, the king of the northern tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, supposed to be ruling on behalf of God, intermarrying with a pagan nation, knowing who they are, knowing who they worship, knowing the kind of stuff that's going on there, but creates this political alliance and then takes the princess of the nation to be his wife, knowing full well what that implies. It shows, again, the condition of Ahab, the wickedness of Ahab. And so this is how Jezebel gets on the scene. This is how she becomes the queen. So you have this little girl growing up, being groomed to becoming the high priestess to these demonic deities and enduring all that stuff she would have experienced and went through. Now all of a sudden she's a woman and Baal worshiper, a worshiper of the goddess Astarte. She's already has a heart that's wicked, that opposes Yahweh. And now she becomes the queen of the northern kingdom of Israel. So she steps onto the scene, and then makes perfect sense then. And she sees Ahab. She sees that Ahab doesn't have a backbone. She sees that Ahab is workable. And then she digs her claws into him and uses his power and authority to promote her will in the land. And so it's no wonder when you see where she came from, how she ended up the way that she ended up. So that's the second level. That's the second layer I want to look at about who Jezebel is. And so the third layer I want to look at involving who Jezebel is the supernatural element behind it. And so there's a few different parts that we're going to discover here on this layer. And so firstly is this. When we look back to her upbringing and we see, again, the fact that she was born into a royal lineage of idolatry, and she was groomed to become like this high priestess to these demonic deities. And she went through and have experienced all these ceremonies and rituals and sacrifices and all this demonic stuff. To have her go through all of that and not become possessed by demonic spirits is ridiculous. To just think that, oh, she just grew up to be this evil woman and that's all she was. She just was someone who didn't love God, and she was just very bad. And she just did bad things, and, that's it. I think that behind all of the evil that she did as a queen, as the queen of the northern kingdom of Israel, that all the murder that she organized, the idolatry she led people in, the raising up of false prophets throughout the land, the sorcery and the witchcraft and the occult that she was involved in, and then you have the prostitution, sexual perverse element, all that stuff that she orchestrated, that she manipulated, that she controlled, that she infiltrated through weak King Ahab, wasn't just that she was just very bad. It was demonically inspired. And so I want to suggest that, and there's no text that says it specifically. So again, this is me, this is my opinion. When I look at the situation, there's no way she could go through all of that stuff and not be demonically possessed, not pick up any kind of demonic spirits, demons running her. There's just no way. You can't get to that level of evil and that level of power and of influence and not be demonically controlled by demonic entities, demonic forces, demonic spirits, whatever term you want to use there. And so why do I say that? Now, if you have been following me for a while, I've done a number of videos, podcasts on the Nephilim, on what I think to be the skeleton key in unlocking the entire Bible, the entire supernatural worldview of the Bible. In Genesis 6, we have the fallen angels, fallen sons of God, the Watchers, come to earth and procreate with human women, creating a hybrid race called the Nephilim. These half divine, half human hybrids who were the giants of old. And the all mythology, all Greek mythology, Roman mythology, from all the civilizations, they all come from right here. Every ancient civilization has this story in it, of the demigods, where you have the gods mating with human women, creating demigods. I mean, all this stuff is everywhere. This is where it comes from right here, Genesis 6. And they were the giants of old. They were this race that they completely controlled the pre-flood world. They raised civilizations all over the world. And this is what led to the flood. And so God wipes out the flood, but then we see them pop up again after the flood. And this is why God tells Joshua and Israel, go into the promised land and start wiping out all those tribes. The Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Amalekites, all the ites. He says, wipe them all out. Why? They were Nephilim tribes. They were giant clans. And they were hybrids. So that's why God says, even the kids and the cattle, destroy them, because they had corrupted everything. Now, when they died, according to ancient rabbinic literature dating back between when the second temple was built and when the second temple was destroyed, that 400 or 500 year period, according to the rabbinic literature and other pieces of literature that were written during that time, they believed, the common belief was, so this is what Jesus believed, what the disciples believed, what the early church believed, was that demons were the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. So when God sent the flood, killed all the Nephilim, and then when Israel went in and they killed all the giant clans that we see in the conquest narrative all the way up to David, when they died, because they're part divine, part human, it's like their spirits had nowhere to go. They kind of lingered on the earth. And so this is why when we think about demons, we think about demons need to possess objects, possess bodies, animals, humans, because that's how they can interact with our world. And so they need like a host body, if you will, to use that language. And so if this is what demons are, and this is what I believe, and this is what a lot of scholars believe, that demons are not just random demonic spirits that the devil made or something like that, but they're actually disembodied spirits of Nephilim. It leads me to think then, when you look at the pre-flood world, there's also a hierarchy in the kingdom of darkness. And so not every single Nephilim that was born was a king, was a ruler. There was different levels of authority and position and rank. And so if you were a Nephilim spirit, so if you were a Nephilim and then you died and then your disembodied spirit is roaming the earth, but you were like the king, top dog when you were on the earth, it makes sense to me that you would then seek out positions of power and authority. You wouldn't just seek out random people to possess. And so when we think about Jezebel, we think about her dad, we think about their lineage. To me, it makes sense then that if demons are disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, and you look at all the stuff that she did, all the stuff that they went through, all the stuff that they've welcomed into their lineage, into their family, into their practice, into their lifestyle, that she got possessed either by a few or one or whatever of disembodied spirits of Nephilim rulers. And I've never heard anyone say this before. So again, this is just my opinion. There's no Bible verse that says this. I'm just trying to take the data and make it fit together in a way that I've never heard before. It's clearly that she was possessed, but she wasn't just possessed by random demons. I think she was possessed by high-ranking, disembodied spirits of Nephilim rulers that ruled before the flood. And so they pegged out that royal line, that lineage, which then ultimately led to her dad and then ultimately her becoming possessed because she was princess, destined to rule, and then becomes the queen of the people of God, of the northern kingdom of Israel. Like, that's not coincidence. So I think she was possessed by a high-ranking demonic or disembodied spirit of a Nephilim, who then used her to push out and infiltrate the kingdom of Israel, or the northern kingdom of Israel, for evil purposes. You know, she was the open vessel. She was the willing vessel. It's all that she knew. I'm not making excuses. It's just, it is what it is. And this is why I think she got to that level of authority and wickedness and rulership in her life, why she was able to have such an influence with Ahab, who was supposed to be the king. She basically ran him, usurped his authority, used him as a puppet, was able to just do all the stuff that she did in God's kingdom. And she wasn't just possessed with like low-ranking demonic entities, low-ranking disembodied spirits of Nephilim, but I think she was possessed with some high-ranking entities there. And so now when we get into, and so that again, that's my opinion. This is my conjecture, fitting things together. And so when we get into like the Jezebel spirit, we bring it into modern day here, and we're going to connect this now. This is the second part of the supernatural layer. Again, growing up in the church, or I should say this, with Driscoll and what he just did again, he basically said that the Jezebel spirit opened the conference. And so in this situation, he argued, he exposed, or he put forth the idea that the spirit of Jezebel was running the show, that performance routine by the former male stripper was just laced with Jezebel-like influence. That when we look at who Jezebel was when she was queen over the northern kingdom of Israel, with the seduction, prostitution, with pushing out anti-God agendas, and I mean, Mark is saying this has that written all over it. And so there are a lot of churches, a lot of ministries, a lot of Christian leaders that throughout history have had these kind of metrics used to define their ministries, where we see things like, this definitely has a Jezebel spirit vibe to it. There's something going on here that just, it doesn't feel right, doesn't look right. Something's going on. And so that's why oftentimes you'll see people, oh, that church, man, they got a Jezebel spirit going on there. And again, there's so many different characteristics to what that is. And then we also see Jezebel spirit used in like deliverance ministry. And so those of you that have been involved in that or have heard about that, I know for me personally, when I was pastoring, I was involved in deliverance ministry, and one of the most difficult demonic spirits to cast out were, quote unquote, the Jezebel spirit. And the reason why I went into that whole Nephilim origin story is because that's why I think they're the toughest to deal with. Why I think that they have the most influence in, like, demonically speaking, in bringing down churches and bringing down leaders and infiltrating God's people. Because it's not about Jezebel's spirit, her in and of herself. Like, it wasn't, she was just an evil woman. She was just a woman who got jacked up with a whole bunch of demonic nonsense. It's what she grew up in, and she allowed it, but that's how she was used. And I think it was, again, high-ranking, disembodied spirits of Nephilim from of old who were running the show, and that's why she had so much influence and control. And that's why that when we talk about Jezebel's spirit, it's not just evil permeating a church. It's actual, high-ranking demonic spirits running the show, or impacting and infiltrating churches and or people. And so when someone is possessed with a Jezebel-like spirit, they're possessed with a high-ranking, disembodied spirit of a Nephilim. And that's why they're the toughest to deal with. Those of you, again, who've been involved in deliverance ministry, you'll be more familiar with, like, spirit of lust or spirit of anger or spirit of rage, or we often name or focus on the function of a spirit, but it's usually behind all of that. They're like blocking spirits. They're like the low-ranking ones that get in the way, but usually behind all of that is the quote-unquote Jezebel spirit, the one who is just a lot more difficult to work with, who's a lot more of again, higher demonic rank. And you tie that into the origin of demons and who they are and what they are. So I think the Jezebel spirit is a Nephilim spirit. There's nothing about her. It's not like she's possessing people. It's the spirit that was on her is still alive and active today. And I think that's what we have to understand. That the Jezebel spirit isn't just about one ancient woman who was queen, who is an evil queen, and is still affecting people today. It's the spirit that was on her, running her, causing her to do everything that she did, is still active today in the church on big scales and all the way and smaller scales. So to land the plane here, when we're talking about the Jezebel spirit, I mean, it's clear that this spirit is still alive and active. I mean, we see it in secular culture, and now we see it in the church. And we have to remember that, especially as Christians, when we see it, we have to expose it and address it. Because if you leave a Jezebel spirit unchecked, it's going to just breed destruction and disaster, either in people's lives individually or in a church body corporately. So that's why what Driscoll did, I mean, I think he did what he had to do, even though it was met with so much controversy and yeah, a lot of people didn't like that. I agree with it. It's got to be addressed. It's got to be exposed. And so the Jezebel spirit is not some spirit of an ancient Israelite queen that's still wreaking havoc. I think it's why I made the whole Nephilim connection. I think it's high-ranking, disembodied spirits of Nephilim who were wreaking havoc before the flood, who are wreaking havoc in the period after the flood, and who are still wreaking havoc today in our world. And so I hope that this kind of brought a bit of more clarity, so it's not just some vague statement, and that being able to look at who the actual woman Jezebel was and seeing the things that she did and what she was a part of, that it can help us now look at our churches, look at different situations and kind of discern, hey, this isn't cool. This has got the markings of a Jezebel spirit. And so I think that's how that phrase got coined. Which, again, I have absolutely no problem with. I think it makes sense. I know a lot of people have been confused by that phrase, Jezebel spirit, and what that actually is. But to me, it's just a high-ranking demonic presence that used her to do what she did, and that same spirit is still alive and is active today. And needs to be exposed and needs to be battled in the presence of the Lord. Can't be left unchecked. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on the Jezebel spirit. And again, there's so much more you could get into, but this is just, I think I've said everything I needed to say. I hope that it made sense. Man, it took me a few times to record this just because I wanted to make sure I got everything in there, and hopefully this was cohesive. Hopefully it was coherent enough to understand and follow. But yeah, feel free to leave any questions or comments below. Start a dialogue. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you agreed with or disagreed with, or yeah, just share your thoughts. So thanks so much for listening and or watching episode 36, and we will see you in the next one. Much love and God bless.